All right, so I was watching this or reading this news article, and on the article, in the article, it was about a reporter, very well-known reporter, and he said that he had the other night he just couldn't take it anymore, and instead of doing his regular blog or whatever it is he does, maybe it's a vlog, he just went in his bedroom, climbed up under the blankets, and just cried and cried and cried and cried because he was just thinking about this COVID-19 and just how much it had impacted his life. And for a second there, I thought to myself, okay, come on. But as I said in my lesson this morning, people suffer in different ways. And maybe for him, it's just too much for him to handle that, he just can't take. And I find it curious because he's a news reporter. You would think that, he goes through a lot of stressful situations, but maybe not, I'm not sure. So I got to thinking, and we're seeing a lot of things out there right now that people are doing, and people are being upset, and people are saying things on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram and news and whatever outlet somebody can get a hold of. They're saying a lot of things. In fact, there was a mayor 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago, he put on Facebook a picture of the Ku Klux Klan, and he said, I guess the Trump supporters shouldn't be upset because they're already wearing masks. So if you have to wear a mask, it'd be upsetting. And of course, then he later on came and apologized. People were telling him to step down. And then I found out today he actually died in a plane crash this week. His plane went down and he died in it. But the example, I thought about that. I said, what is the example that people are setting going through this? Right? What's the example that we're setting when we go through this? And I know sometimes you begin to hear all this input information from out there, different people, right? You're reading things, seeing things. And if someone is mocking your particular political party or your president or your congresswoman or congressman and whoever it may be, your governor, and you're very supportive of those individuals, you may take it wrong. And you may begin to act out. There have already been people in this situation who've committed suicide. There was an older couple. They were so panicked over it, they just did a joint suicide. At least that's the way it seems to be. So how are we letting things like this, and not just this is just a good jumping off point because it's here. How do we let things affect us in our life, and what kind of example are we during times of crisis or when things aren't so bad? Either way. So we know that when it comes to being an example, everybody's going to be an example, right? It's just whether or not we're going to be a good example or a bad example. So when it comes to our Christian walk, how are we handling and what is our example to our friends and family? Or if we're posting things on Facebook and Instagram, and if we're tweeting things, what's the example that we're setting, right? Are we making our politics more important than our faith? Do we go out there and I follow a lot of people, and I see a lot of Christians, the majority of them are Christians, who post more about politics than they do about the Lord. There's just a lot of that out there, and I'm just like, haven't heard you mention Jesus lately, but you sure have talked a lot about these other things. And there's nothing wrong with talking about those other things. It's part of life, right? I post stuff like that too. But there needs to be a caution, because sometimes we can say things and not be able to take them back and do some damage that's irreparable, right? And you see that right now when it comes to this whole, every time the president gets up, there's a back and forth between them. Trump doesn't always handle it the best way. The news media doesn't handle it the best way. turns into nothing but a big old bickering session and a bunch of children just fighting over, right? I'm sure they both have their share in this. But it's because they allow their frustrations to get the best of them. You know, I was thinking about this today, and just as a way of maybe having some understanding of what it would be like to be in a situation like this as a president. In a very minuscule way this morning, I'm sitting here just trying to get this live stream and the sound to work while I'm trying to sing songs, preparing my mind for the Lord's Supper, and then stand up here and preaching. And it's just like, I just about threw everything down and said, forget it. Just forget it. Just like, and that's just a little tiny thing. So you can see the frustration how people can, lose it because they're just like, one person trying to do all this and he's trying to make decisions. And you can see the other side where people are frustrated because they're not getting the answers they want or the answers they think they should have or whatever it may be. A lot of frustration. All right. So then how do we handle that? What is going to be our example? So the question, what kind of example am I, is either bad or good. And that's the 2 points we're going to look at. The bad example and the good example. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, if you want to take a look over there, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul, writing Timothy, states this about his character. He says, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself as an example, or show yourself an example as those who believe, or of those who believe. So Timothy, if we understand what's going on in Timothy, there's pressure. He's dealing with false teachers. He's a young man, young preacher. And so the warning seems to indicate that the possibility of not being the example that you should be is there because of the pressure. But Paul is telling Timothy, you need to be a good example. One who's an example of those who believe. What is your character as a believer? And that says something to us. It says that believers are supposed to have a specific character that is a particular kind of example. Just not any kind of example. It's the example of those who believe. What does that look like? So we're going to begin, though, with the bad example. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, or excuse me, 2 Peter chapter 2, not Timothy, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. 2 Peter 2, 4 through 6. Peter says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. So we can be an example of an ungodly life. They were examples of ungodly living. And that example also demonstrates that there's a penalty for that. There's a price to pay for living that way. So if we want to be a bad example, then we live according to our flesh. We let ourselves give into our frustrations, our angers. We allow that. That's giving into the flesh. It's not always necessarily considered a righteous indignation. Sometimes you're just mad. You're just upset. And you strike out because of that. And so we can be that example, a bad example. Look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We can be an example of those who desire evil. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 6. Paul here writes, "Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." So we can be an example of these kind of people, the example of people who desire to rise up against God, desire to fulfill whatever they wanted rather than doing the will of God. We can be an example of the kind of people who craved evil things. Verse 6, "Now these happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved." So we're going to be that kind of example. Look over in Hebrews chapter 4. We can be an example of disobedience. Hebrews 4, beginning in verse 4. "For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as has been said before, today if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would have not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience." So we could be an example of disobedience. We can be an example of people who are going to go contrary to what God wants us to do and be. That'll be an example. It's not a good example. In fact, it's a bad example. In all these situations, it's not a positive outcome. And they paid the penalty for that. So when we look at this idea of examples, what kind of example are we going to be? In Jude verses 5 through 7. "Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things, once for all, that the Lord, after saving his people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he is kept in eternal bonds until under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulge in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." But we could be that example too. We could be an example of those undergoing eternal fire, as Sodom and Gomorrah was. They became an example for us. The way they lived, the things that they chose to do, these people, their example was an example of disobedience. It's an example of giving into their own flesh, living according to their own flesh. It was an example of desiring evil, and thus they become an example of eternal punishment. That's not a good example. That's not the kind of example we want to be. So if we're looking at what's taking place today, there are all sorts of frustrations out there, right? We know that. But if you go to the grocery store, I went to Costco after worship this morning, had to get some gas. I'm not going into the store. Forget that business. I just went to the pump. was able to get in there right away. Got my fuel. As I'm driving, they have this line snaking along the outside wall of Costco. Or, as you might call it, a powder keg next to the wall of Costco. Just waiting for someone to get irritated because you're standing too close. Stop pushing, stop crowding. Or, I'm just getting tired of standing in this line. Why are we moving faster? You can just hear, and I've seen things on the news already where that's happened. I saw a video the other day where a lady was in the store and she got into a fight with these other people, fist fight, because they stood too close to her. As if her swinging punches wasn't bringing her closer to them. I'm like, now you're all wrapped up in these people. Later on, she called and she apologized because they said she's a regular customer and she just lost her head. She didn't control herself. And those type of things can flare up. People get angry. People get frustrated because other people are not acting the same way as they believe you should act in this situation. Right? And so they get angry because you're not doing the same thing they are. Everybody's got to make up their own mind what they're going to do. How are we going to respond? How are we going to act? What kind of example are we going to be? I figure this, if there's people out there, and I went to Home Depot the other day, had to go pick up some batteries, and went to Home Depot, and I was the guy out of place because I had gloves, full mask. It's a cool mask. It's the skull face. I had my hat, had my glasses. All you could see was like about this much flesh. I had a long sleeve jacket. I walked into Home Depot and it was a beach party. Short sleeve shorts, somebody wearing masks. They're all like, what's going on? There's 1,000 people running everywhere. Now I could have got angry and said, you idiots, what is wrong with you people? I just said, well, I'm covered. Lady comes up and she's making sure she sprays. Every time somebody goes to the checkout, she sprays the whole thing. Some people would walk in that and just be flabbergasted, just be livid about how other people are responding. So my advice is this: if you don't like that, don't go there. Don't let yourself get overtaken by this. Let people do what they're going to do. But maintain a good example. All right, so we know we can be a bad example. And being a bad example is easy. It really is. It's not difficult to be a bad example. I can be a bad example in a second. A millisecond, you can be a bad example. In any given situation, you could just lose it and act inappropriate. And if we go back again and look at these situations we considered, God used them as a lesson for us. And so maybe that's something that we can learn when we look out there and we see how some people are reacting to this. It's a lesson to learn. You know, we talk about, and I was thinking about this morning, the idea of the good that can come from this, but the bad that also comes from it. And I thought, well, and I know this may be saying a very similar thing, but it's like learn from the good and grow from the bad. That's basically the same thing, but it's the idea that even in a bad situation, you can grow from it, you can learn from it. As these individuals were examples that we can learn from. All right, so what is the good example then? How can we be a good example as we go through this difficult time? A good example of, as Paul told Timothy, a good example of those who believe, believers. In 1 Peter chapter 2, if you want to go over there, 1 Peter chapter 2, we have the example of Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 20 and 21. He says, "For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. Now, granted, I know that what he's talking about here is the persecution they're facing because of their faith. Nevertheless, Christ still suffered in other ways than just being persecuted. He's an example. He's an example of patience. He's an example of wisdom. He's an example of not striking back at those who were constantly attacking him. He was one who would hold his tongue and speak when he needed to speak, made his statements, but didn't just become unhinged. So certainly when you look at the suffering of Christ, we can look at the pain that he went through, physical pain, as an example. But in 1 Peter, one of the things that Peter keeps reminding them of is what their character should be like while they're going through that. He goes over that again and again. As a matter of fact, if you look at what he says there in verse 20, he's talking about their character right here. He says, for what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure with patience? So what? So what that you endure the harsh treatment with patience, you're deserving of it. You can't sit there and say, yeah, man, I held up under that beating, whatever it may be, that harsh treatment. But you're deserving of it because you've done something wrong. On the other hand, he says, but if, when you do what is right, there's the character, and you suffer. That's a different story. So, in our current situation, there may be things that we're going through that are causing suffering, as I said this morning, in our life. What kind of example are we being of that? How are we handling ourselves? When you get on the phone and your Amazon hasn't shown up, or you've ordered something and you're just screaming at the person at the other end that you need that stuffed animal you ordered because you just can't survive without your comfort pet, although it's not even real, or whatever it may be. Angry because your food that you ordered, you're trying to shop locally and it didn't show up on time, or you go in and you can't find what you want, and you're upset at the people who work at the store as if they've got control over what's coming into the place. Why can't I find toilet paper? What's wrong with you people? Well, why are people acting that way? That's not a good example. A good example is an example of patience. Say, well, I appreciate it, and I'll go look somewhere else. I'll figure out something else. Hebrews chapter 12. We can be an example of endurance. That's something to be at this point in time. Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, or of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we can be an example of endurance. That we don't let the weight of whatever's going on in your life personally right now, if it's isolation, if it's lack of something in your life, if it's not being able to see the family, or just being with each other, or going to a job. I mean, some people may not realize this, but there's a lot of people that have a difficulty not going to a job, not just because they're not getting a paycheck, but they need to be working. They want to work, and it's just like, I'm going crazy, not going out there doing something. But we can be an example of endurance, of people who are going through difficult times, but we're not letting those things overtake us. We're patient with it and say, look, anybody here, raise your hand. Nobody, you can't see them, but they're probably not going to raise their hand anyway. But anybody here have any control of what the federal government's going to do? No, you don't. So let's rise up. Let's take our pitchforks and hoes and guns and let's go down to the Capitol and force it. Nobody's going to do that either. But we can be patient, and we can be an example of patience and just endure. Jesus had to, and he's an example of that. The example that we find in the scriptures of his disciples were good examples. When you go back and you look at people such as Paul, the kind of disciplined life that he lived. And certainly Paul had to live a disciplined life. The things that he faced, the struggles that were of his choice. I mean, he's the one that made the decision to become a Christian. And in the process, there was a lot of turmoil in his life. Over in 2 Thessalonians in chapter 3, beginning in verse 6, Paul says, "Now we command you, brethren," 2 Thessalonians 3:6, "Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus, that you keep away from every brother who leads an unruly life, and not according to the tradition which you receive from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined manner among you. Nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labor and hardship we kept working night and day, so that we would not be a burden to any of you." He says, not because we don't have a right to this, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you, so that you would follow our example. So we can be an example of those who endure, go through difficult times, act in a proper way. He said, we didn't act in any unbecoming way before you. And so as Christians, when we're out here in the world and we happen to go to the store, or we happen to order something, or whatever it may be, however contact we may have with somebody, if we're putting something on Facebook or tweeting something out or whatever it may be that kind of example that would be an example for others to follow. One, as Paul said, of a disciplined life. One who controls his emotions. Look, things are going to frustrate us. That's a given. I'm not saying you're not going to get frustrated. I get frustrated. It's not we're not going to get frustrated. There's nothing wrong with being frustrated. It's just how you respond to that frustration. What is the example that frustration leads you to be? Maybe you can be an example of someone who prays a lot because you're frustrated a lot. Maybe that's a good example. You can be like, I am so frustrated. I prayed more in my last 3 or 4 weeks I can think of, right? Paul said that he wanted them to follow his model. He said in verse 9, to offer ourselves as a model for you. That word model is pattern. A pattern. How we should respond, how we should act. Look over in 1 Timothy. We had started with Timothy. 1 Timothy in chapter 4. What kind of example was he? Remember, he faced persecution in Ephesus. 1 Timothy 4, down in verse 12. Again, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself as an example of those who believe. Until I come, give attention to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, and to teaching. Do not neglect the spiritual gift within you, which was bestowed on you through prophetic utterance with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Take pains with these things. Be absorbed in them, so that your progress will be evident to all. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Persevere in these things. For as you do this, you will ensure salvation both for yourselves and for those who hear you. Listen to the emphasis he makes here to Timothy. He's telling Timothy that you need to be an example of a believer. But that's just not going to happen because you say, okay, I'm going to be an example of a believer. You're going to have to work at it. Because the natural thing, we have emotions, we have feelings, right? Do I not also bleed, right? Don't we suffer, have grief, right, as Christians? So what does he tell them to do? Listen to these words. Verse 15. Take pains with these things. It's like the idea you go to a gym and you want to build up. You can't walk into a gym. You can't pick up a 5-pound weight. and sit there and curl a 5-pound weight for the next 6 months and wonder why you're not getting any bigger. Take pains, increase. No pain, no gain. So it says, take pains with these things. Be absorbed. Be absorbed in them. The idea of let them consume you. Let what consume you? The kind of person you're supposed to be. Why? That your progress will be evident. When people look at you, it's like, wow, you've been working out. Your progress is evident. I can tell you going to the gym, you're slimming and you're buffing. Your progress is evident. Or I can tell that you've been sitting at home and doing nothing because you're enlarging and you're getting heavier. That's an example too. It's just not the right example. Your progress will be evident. Your manner of speech, your conduct when situations unfold, unpleasant situations. He says, pay close attention to yourself, Not, look what everybody else is doing. Look, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. He says, pay close attention to yourself. Right? Check yourself. And to your teaching. Persevere in these things. Oh, my word. Take pains. Be absorbed. Pay attention. Persevere. I thought it was going to be easy to be an example of Christ. I thought it was going to be easy to be a Christian example. No, it takes work. And this is one of those times when you're put to the test to do that. It's easy to be the good person and act Christ-like when there's no heat to the feet. But when the pressure's on and your temperature begins to rise and your frustration begins to boil over, then it's something different. And if you think about Timothy, he's under pressure. He's under pressure because he's a young preacher. They got these people in Ephesus that are pursuing after him, trying to keep him from doing the work he's supposed to do. But if he wants to succeed, he needs to seek to be that good example. So in each of these examples that we've looked at, you've got a positive result. In fact, if you think about how Paul concluded that, he says, if you do this, and think about the ramifications of this. With the bad example, ultimately, they become an example of eternal punishment, right? But in this example, Paul said that Timothy will not only save his soul, but help others as well. So he says, your conduct, your character can affect the salvation of somebody. How you conduct yourself can affect the salvation of somebody. So during this time, as we're going through these difficulties, we need to consider that. What is our conduct? And not just because of that. That certainly is an overwhelming reason. But when it comes to our conduct, are we going to be a good example or a bad example? And look, no one's saying that this is a pleasant experience. I mean, maybe there's somebody out there who thinks it's a wonderful thing. But the majority of people don't think it's a great experience. That doesn't mean we can't learn something from it. That doesn't mean that we can't teach others something from it. Especially what it means to be a Christian. By maintaining the conduct of a Christian and letting people see that.